Horace and Clara Dudley are caretakers who live in a cottage close to Hill House. They live a quiet and secluded life with their daughter Abigail, who they keep isolated from the outside world. The Dudleys have a long and complicated history with Hill House, more akin to something like a love-hate relationship. They are very much aware of the threat of the evil that lurks behind the walls of Hill House, but they rely on Hill House for their income and seem unable to truly stay away from the house. They have been long-time caretakers and have been taking care of the house long before the Cranes arrive. The two families will be forever intertwined due to the house's malevolent design. While the Dudleys are secondary characters in the show, they will serve as reflections for the main characters, in particular Hugh, Olivia, and Luke. On the show, it is mentioned that the Dudleys come with the house. In many ways, the Dudleys will act as guardians, not only for the house, but for those unfortunate souls who reside there. Horace Dudley is a gruff but polite and soft-spoken man. He is a handyman of sorts and was hired by Hugh to fix up Hill House. Horace will appear sporadically on the show and not for very long, but each time he does, he reveals himself to be a humble and kind man. As mentioned before, this is not Horace's first experience with the eponymous house. In episode 7, Eulogy, after seeing Olivia's strange blueprints of the house, Horace opens up to Hugh in an attempt to convince Hugh that the house is malevolent and that Olivia is in danger. Horace gives Hugh a brief summary of his life. Here, we learn that Horace was actually born at Hill House. His mother worked as kitchen staff. His family then moved into the cottage on the property. The family would later buy the property from Hazel Hill. This is where Horace and his family currently live. Horace recounts the strange happenings he has witnessed over the years with the house, particularly its effects on the people who live and work on the grounds. Horace recounts how his mother never liked Hill House, and when she comes home after spending an unusually long amount of time, or after staying there after dark, she would start acting scattered. This includes some troubling behavior, like talking to herself, and in her old age, she started to wander into the woods barefoot, seemingly giggling like a schoolgirl in love in the cold woods alone. She would even start to sleep in the woods as well. After his mother passes, Horace meets Clara, who started to work for Hazel Hill. The two even got married on the grounds of Hill House. After Hazel Hill starts to fall ill, Clara spends more and more time at Hill House. Around this time, Clara gets pregnant, but due to the pressures and demands from Hazel Hill, Clara continued to work throughout her pregnancy. Sadly, the baby would be born a stillborn, with heavy implications that it may have been caused by Clara being overworked by Hazel and spending too much time at Hill House. It is clear that Horace loves his wife dearly, but it is his respect for her that really shines through when he talks about his wife. He calls Clara a strong and towering woman. He mentions that even after something so traumatic such as losing a child, Clara returns to work only after a month because she didn't want to linger on her issues. But Clara starts to have terrifying nightmares, and after one night while she was cleaning the master bedroom, Clara starts to hear a baby crying. She frantically looks for the baby. Instinctively, Clara seems to be aware that this is the baby she lost. Unable to find the baby, and with the house taunting her, she flees into the night, running through the woods in the dark. Her face is scratched by the branches as she flees. Horace returns that night to inspect, and he too hears his lost baby crying. Again, like Clara, Horace has the same realization that this is the sound of his dead daughter's cries. The cry she was never able to cry in life, she now cries in death. After this occurrence, the Dudleys decide that they will no longer be coming to work after dark. Even at the risk of being let go by Hazel, the Dudleys refuse to work at Hill House once dinner is served. Horace admits that it may come out of superstition, but he says that it worked. Staying away after dark has alleviated the nightmares and the strange occurrence both he and his wife experienced. Again, Horace shares this with Hugh, even acknowledging that giving advice about how to deal with Olivia's strange behavior might be overstepping into the Cranes' personal family life. But Horace does not do this out of malice. He is warning Hugh out of concern for the Cranes' well-being. Clara Dudley is first introduced in a scene with the young Steve Crane. She informs Steve that no one in town will come close to the house. No staff has lived on the grounds since 1948. We see that Clara is already trying to warn Steve about the house here, trying to spook him a little, but Steve is unfazed. Clara presses Steve on whether or not he believes in Christianity and the words of Jesus Christ. She argues that the secular world is too preoccupied with science, and that science is never an actual, exact science. Here, Clara reveals her faith and how the power of God will offer protection, especially in the darkness. She views the world as a dangerous and evil place. When she is about to press Steve on his knowledge of the Gospels, Olivia intervenes and politely but firmly tells her that Steve is taught many different religions and philosophies from all over the world. She and Steve quote Shakespeare's Hamlet. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt in your philosophy." While this is meant to rebuff Clara, to point out to her that her belief in God and her religion also has limitations, this quote will also later reaffirm Clara's view on the secular world. That there are also things in this world that cannot be explained by science and is beyond human understanding, Hill House being a prime example. This interaction will set a trend of the two women in opposition against one another in terms of philosophy, with Olivia representing the secular world and Clara as a stand-in for the religious one. Similar to her husband, Clara will appear throughout the show sporadically, offering up tidbits of information on the house through her interactions with the Cranes. When Luke is caught playing with the dumbwaiter in the kitchen, Clara scolds him and grabs him by the arms. When Theo steps in and tells Clara to let him go, Clara explains that this is not a toy and that it could be dangerous. As Clara escorts the children out of the kitchen, a passing lingering touch on Theo's shoulder reveals that Clara isn't trying to be mean to Luke. She was just scared that something might happen to him. Clara's fears were not unfounded. Later that night, Luke sneaks down to play with the dumbwaiter. He convinces Theo to press the button for him so he can ride the dumbwaiter up. But as she presses the button, it takes him down into the hidden basement, where he is later attacked by the burnt ghost. In another episode, when Nell discovers the teacup of stars, she asks Clara about whether or not she can keep it. Clara is surprised to see the cup and tells Nels that this must have been Jacqueline Hill's old teacup set. She recounts how as Hazel Hill started to grow old and senile, she would say that Jacqueline needed her cup of stars. In a very grim and sad twist, this cup of stars would play a huge role in Clara Dudley's own daughter's demise with the deadly tea party. As mentioned before, Olivia and Clara appear at odds with one another. However, as the story unfolds, it becomes quite evident that the two women are much more alike than initially perceived. In the episode Screaming Mimes, there are two separate dialogues where the two women have conversations with one another. Each conversation is deeply symbolic and offers great insight into how the house has affected both women mentally. After the night of the strange storm that destroyed some of the windows at Hill House, Clara is seen cleaning up broken debris from the hallway. Olivia approaches and kneels down to help Clara. Notice that both women are dressed in blue. While their clothing is very different, their outfits now match in hue, almost as if to hint how there is more of a sense of unity and calm between the two women in this scene. Olivia kneels down and helps Clara pick up the broken debris, like she's now coming down to meet Clara at Clara's level. This is a very different scene from their previous conversation in the first episode, where the two women appear to be worlds apart. Even the costuming shows how different the two women are. In the first scene, we see Clara wearing a very old-fashioned conservative dark blouse and skirt with her hair pinned up, while Olivia is wearing a more modern casual outfit with her hair down. In their first conversation in the first episode, Olivia is coming from a place of power and authority. But here, in this scene, she is vulnerable and more open to Clara. Again, now we are seeing the women wearing more similar outfits in blue. Both have similar looking silhouettes. Both are also wearing necklaces. Olivia with her signature locket, and Clara with what presumably is her cross. We don't get a good look of it in this scene, unfortunately, but she is seen wearing it in episode 1, so I am assuming that this is the same cross. Olivia opens up to Clara about her childhood. She tells Clara that her father died when she was very young. She wasn't able to cry for a few days, but after a while, she was sitting in her dad's old recliner, and suddenly all her emotions swelled up and she started to cry. As she was doing so, a strange storm appeared outside her home. What seemed like hail turned out to be actually stone. Black stone raining down, battering the house. Her mother came running inside to help her and her sister Janet, but as suddenly as it came, the storm stopped. Olivia explained that the storm was a natural phenomenon, citing Harrisonville, Ohio in 1991, and Sicily, where pumice stone rained down from Mount Etna. Clara points out that this also happens in Revelations. Here, we see Clara now asking about the Shakespeare quote again. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. This time, the quote is used to point out to Olivia that there is more than the secular world, that there may be more than science can explain. Olivia also mentions how she thought as a child that maybe she made it rain rocks. She thought that because she was going through such a horrible time, all her negative emotions must have built up and she shot them up into the sky and it rained back down on her. There may be more truth to this than childish belief, as it seems like the house seems to react to those who enter it, and vice versa. This mysterious storm that happened at Hill House might just be another manifestation of Olivia's state of mind. Her troubling thoughts, her fears, have turned into actual physical and destructive force that will threaten her family. In the same episode, Clara and Olivia have another conversation. This time, Olivia is clearly unwell and in distress. She's sitting in the room with all the statues. Clara is on her way to drop off paints for Steve for his secret present for his mother. When Olivia inquires about the paint, Clara confesses, and the two women have a very important conversation that will greatly affect Olivia in unintentional ways. Olivia starts off saying that she now understands why Clara homeschools her daughter. She didn't before, but her recent experiences at Hill House has made her understand why Clara would want to keep her child close, to keep her safe. Olivia tells Clara that she's been feeling overwhelming horror about how the world will harm her children, that something terrible will happen to them. She tries to soothe herself, saying that it was probably just nerves and anxiety, but Clara disagrees and tells her no, it isn't just nerves, and if she feels like her children needs her to protect them, she must. Clara tells Olivia that the world out there has teeth, and it is hungry and it is stupid, and it eats and eats mindlessly. It doesn't care that they are innocent. She urges Olivia to listen to her gut and stand firm. She also urges Olivia to protect her children at any cost, even if it makes them hate her, even if her husband comes to hate her. In a very tragic twist, this conversation will have extremely horrifying consequences, leading to the deadly tea party where Clara's own daughter Abigail would be poisoned. Olivia, being on the verge of a complete breakdown, takes Clara's suggestion and takes extreme measures to protect her family from the outside world. Hill House had completely twisted Olivia's mind, and she soon believed that to protect her family, she must wake them from their nightmare, i.e., she believes that she has to kill them so they would wake up. Of course, Clara is not to blame here for what happens to her own daughter or to Olivia. She merely reached out in Olivia's time of need to offer her courage and advice. She also urges Olivia to have faith in herself. Not only that, but in the same conversation, Clara tries to warn Olivia about Hill House. She urges Olivia to leave the house as soon as possible. She also tells Olivia, "This house is a strange house. I've worked here a long time, and I can tell you that it is just as stupid as hungry as anything else. We don't stay here after dark, Horace and I, and my child is not allowed to step foot onto this place. Not once." Clara also admits that she didn't even want to come work for the Cranes in the first place. She didn't want to watch another family get fed upon. But when Horace told her that it was a family with children around her daughter's age, she agreed to come help out, but only in the daytime, and to keep an eye out for danger, almost like a guardian. Olivia replies that it's just a house, to which Clara tells Olivia that the house is very different in the night, in the dark. Both women know that this is true, but Hill House is beyond anyone's comprehension, so they leave it vague. With this interaction in mind, the audience can look back now to see Clara's reactions in previous scenes with the children, and it becomes clear why she acted the way she did. Like Theo points out, she isn't mean, she is just terrified that something is going to happen to the children. So she tries to keep a close eye and tries her best to keep them out of harm's way. Clara is wary of everything in the house, hence her once perceived overreactions. Clara is actually framed in one scene, standing in front of a statue of an angel, with wings to her sides. Clara appears like a guardian angel, and like a guardian angel from Christianity, she bestows advice to Olivia in her time of need. She also watches over the family and tries to keep them safe. In this scene, she is dressed in a simple blue dress. Blue is deeply associated in Christianity to the Virgin Mary, the symbol of purity and motherhood. Again, we see Clara being visually paired to Christianity and faith. Unfortunately, only the first half of Clara's advice breaks through to Olivia. Clara is unable to save Olivia. We see the house utilizing fear to twist Olivia to its will and ultimately to her doom. For most of the show, Abigail's true identity is not revealed. We see the events unfold through the perspective of the Cranes, and they always thought she was one of Luke's imaginary friends. Sadly, even Luke would come to remember her as such. Sadly, this is very much not the case. Abigail is very much real, and she was the daughter of Horace and Clara Dudley. She lived in the family cottage close by, across the woods. After the loss of their first daughter, Clara and Horace became extremely wary of the house, but also became overly protective of their daughter. She is homeschooled and barely ever leaves their cottage. She becomes so isolated to the point that even the neighbors and those who live in town barely even know of her existence. Being so lonesome, she begins to sneak away to Hill House in order to play with Luke Crane. Of course, this is kept secret because her parents had forbade her to ever step foot onto the grounds. But the promise of a new friend was way too much for the lonely Abigail. She and Luke begin a very close friendship. She keeps herself hidden from the rest of the Cranes as to not get in trouble, leading them to believe that she's just one of Luke's imaginary friends. Luke talks about her often throughout the show, and at one point he even tries to get her some of Theo's old clothes, but everyone just dismisses him. In episode 9, Screaming Mimes, before Olivia leaves to go see Aunt Janet, Luke asks if Abigail can spend the night. Olivia happily agrees, thinking nothing of it. Luke does exactly that, and Abigail spends the night at Hill House. Unfortunately, her first sleepover will be her last. Luke, Nell, and Abigail are awoken in the middle of the night by the deranged Olivia. Olivia is surprised to find Abigail there in the flesh, but she's delighted to see her. She invites Abigail to join them for their deadly tea party. The children are taken to the Red Room, which is open and ready for their grisly tea party. Unbeknownst to the children, Olivia in her insanity had laced the tea with rat poison and was intent on killing them in an effort to wake them up from their living nightmares. Just as they are about to sip their tea, Olivia starts raving about this nightmare. The twins pause to ask her about what she was talking about. Sadly, Abigail, naive and oblivious to the danger, begins to sip on the tea. This has an almost immediate effect, and she begins to choke and froth at the mouth. She struggles to breathe, succumbing to the poison. She falls over dead, and her spirit is trapped by the house. Her apparition later appears to Olivia in the doorway. Here we see her dressed in a blue dress, again symbolizing her purity and innocence. A mysterious lady appears next to her and leads her down the hall. Now here I have my own theory as to who this ghost is, and I think this mysterious female ghost is actually Abigail's grandmother, who was Horace's mother. She's also wearing blue, and wears clothes that would fit the appropriate time period of when Horace's mother would have been a younger woman. Abigail will appear again later that night when her parents come to Hill House to search for her. To their dismay, the Dudleys along with Hugh discover her body in the Red Room. As her parents weep over her, she again appears in the doorway. Clara and Horace rush towards her and ask who hurt her, to which the silent Abigail points to Olivia's dead body. From the moment of Abigail's death, the Dudleys will forever be bound to Hill House. They've always had a long history with the house, but her death will seal their future, forever binding them to the property. In an effort to protect Abigail's spirit, Dudley and Clara make a deal with Hugh Crane. Initially, Hugh wanted to burn the house to the ground in an effort of stopping it from ever harming anyone else. But in their desperate attempt to protect their daughter, who is now trapped at Hill House, they plead with him to keep the house, arguing that not everything in the house is his to destroy. The two families make a deal. To keep Olivia's memory and name clean from the house's taint, the Dudleys will not say anything about Olivia killing their daughter. Horace convinced Hugh to keep it just between the three of them, so the Crane children will be able to keep their memory of their mother for who she truly was. In exchange, Hugh will keep the Dudleys on as caretakers and stewards to the house so they can be with Abigail. Ultimately, the Dudley story is a reflection of the Cranes. Horace and Hugh are fathers trying their best to keep their families intact while trying to protect them from the horrors of Hill House. Clara and Olivia are mothers who are terrorized by the house. The love they have for their children is used against them, leading to tragedy for their daughters. Abigail and Luke are young children who are often overlooked and are lonely. They are both loved by their families, but they are dismissed most of the times and have a hard time connecting with others. Abigail being kept isolated from the world, and Luke who becomes estranged from his own family due to his reliance on drugs. Abigail's story is probably one of the most tragic stories in the whole show. Her life and death seem to be a life of loneliness and tragedy. Her parents loved her dearly, but they kept her isolated from the outside world out of their fear, a fear that was ultimately used to manipulate the characters and ultimately led to Abigail's death. She was kept so isolated that no one outside of the Dudleys or the Cranes even knew she existed. Even her only friend in life, Luke Crane, comes to forget her and never even thought that she was real, relegating her to a childhood memory, a fantasy. In the final episode, we see the Dudleys remain caretakers until their dying day. In one of the final scenes, an older Clara is being carried to Hill House by the older Horace. She's frail and appears to be dying. Horace says to his dying wife, we're here, Clara. We made it." He kisses her one last time as she passes. Suddenly, the apparition of Clara Dudley, Abigail Dudley, and a baby who is presumed to be their first baby appears in front of Horace, and he watches happily at the sight of his family being reunited in death. This, at least, is a somewhat more uplifting end for the Dudleys. They at least seem to learn from their dealings with the house and are able to understand how it works. Stay out of the house at night to avoid the house's machinations, and if you die on the grounds, your spirit will be trapped at Hill House. In order to be reunited, they intentionally die at Hill House to be with their daughters again. In this way, they're able to determine their own fate and have autonomy over their death and afterlife. In that way, the Dudleys were able to live out their afterlives on their own terms together as a family.